A woman's voice comes through the static. Flat, deliberate. She says, 8, 1, 4, 7, 3. There is no station name, no sign-off, no explanation, just numbers, read aloud on a public radio frequency, and then silence. Someone somewhere was meant to hear that. You just don't know who. That is the contradiction at the heart of this story. A broadcast sent openly across the airwaves, receivable by anyone with the right radio, but carrying a message that was never meant for you. Public signal, private purpose, and no way to know where one ended and the other began.
Welcome to Unexplained History. I'm Tom McKenzie. Today we're going into the world of numbers stations, shortwave radio broadcasts that have been transmitting coded material for decades, with no station ID, no explanation, and no public record of who is behind them or why. If you've never heard one, they are genuinely strange. A jaunty little tune plays, tinny, cheerful, almost like a children's song. Then a voice cuts in and starts reading numbers. And then it's over. No context, no signature, just gone back into the static. Subscribe if you haven't already, because this one runs deep. And if a numbers station has crossed your path before, leave a comment. I'd genuinely like to know what you made of it.
Let's set the scene. Picture a dim living room late at night, a lamp turned low, a cup of tea gone cold on the table, and on that table, a battered shortwave radio, the kind with a long dial and a hiss that fills the room even when nothing is broadcasting. You've been turning the dial slowly the way shortwave listeners do, fishing for something interesting in the noise. And then you find it, a signal, clear enough to make out words, a brief musical phrase first, 4 or 5 notes repeating, like the opening of a tune you almost recognize. Then it stops. And the voice begins. A woman reading numbers in groups, steady pace, no emotion, no variation. She reads the sequence, and then the music comes back, and then silence. You check the program guide. Nothing. You look at the frequency. Nothing listed. You wait to see if someone will explain what just happened. No one does. This is what number stations are. They are recurring shortwave, and sometimes AM or upper sideband broadcasts that transmit structured coded material, spoken numbers, phonetic groups, or data bursts. They carry no station identification, no call sign, no broadcaster name. By every normal standard of radio, they should not exist, and yet they do. They have for a very long time. Some claim these broadcasts were used by British intelligence, run from an RAF base in Cyprus. Others say a low-frequency Russian station carries a retaliation signal of some kind. Some believe number stations have carried orders to individuals living quietly in Western countries, waiting for instructions. None of these claims has been officially confirmed. Some are more plausible than others. But what they share is the same basic architecture, a one-way deniable signal, sent into open air, received in private. That architecture did not appear from nowhere. It grew from decades of radio history, wartime communications, coded military traffic, and the slow realization that a passive receiver could be a powerful tool for people who needed to stay invisible. The shortwave band, with its ability to carry signals across continents, became a space where the mundane and the covert sat side by side, indistinguishable from each other unless you already knew what to listen for. Most listeners who stumbled across these broadcasts just moved on, wrote it off as interference, or a foreign military frequency, or something technical they didn't understand. But some could not let it go. Simon Mason was one of them. He sat with the static long after most people had turned off their sets. He was drawn in not by drama, but by the nagging sense that what he was hearing mattered, that if no one recorded it, it would simply vanish. So he started writing things down. logging frequencies, times, formats, sequences. Night after night, he built a record of something that had no official record at all. What Simon preserved, others would later use. His logs, and the logs of the listeners he helped organize, became a foundation for journalists and investigators who wanted to understand what these broadcasts actually were. The recordings didn't answer the big questions, but they proved the broadcasts were real, consistent, and systematic. That mattered. The waveform itself was public. What it carried could have consequences for real people, and for how nations moved information through the world, quietly, invisibly, through the open air, and no one who heard it could be entirely sure what to do with that.
So that's where we are. We've heard the sound. We've felt the strangeness of it. A voice reading numbers on a public frequency with no explanation attached. But strange sounds don't appear by accident. They come from somewhere. Which brings us to the question we need to answer before we go any further. What kind of history and technology created a public channel people trusted for private messages? So we left things in an uncomfortable place, a broadcast that felt like it was meant for someone, but not you. Now we need to step back and ask how that was even possible. What was the world that allowed this kind of communication to exist openly across thousands of miles and go largely unnoticed? To understand that, we need to look at the technology and at the people who were quietly paying attention.
Shortwave radio works differently from the stations most people were used to. A standard AM broadcast bounces along the ground. Shortwave reaches up into the ionosphere and comes back down again, hundreds or even thousands of miles from where it started. That bounce made it global. It also made it unpredictable. A signal strong and clear at midnight might fade to nothing by morning. Reception depended on solar activity, season, and conditions no one could fully control. By the late 1940s and into the 1950s, shortwave was everywhere in practical terms. Governments used it, militaries used it, commercial broadcasters pushed news and propaganda across borders. And ordinary people had receivers in their homes. Ham radio operators built their own rigs, kept careful logbooks, and listened to whatever came through. The shortwave band was a kind of commons, wide open, technically accessible to anyone with the right equipment. That openness was the point. A clandestine agency that needed to reach an agent in a foreign country faced a hard problem. Two-way contact risked exposing both sides. Telephone lines could be monitored, couriers could be followed. But a one-way shortwave broadcast, the sender transmits. The receiver listens. The receiver never transmits back. There is nothing to trace on the receiving end. No signal going out, no location to fix. When that broadcast was paired with a one-time pad, the security became close to absolute. A one-time pad is a cipher where every message uses a completely unique key, used once and then discarded. If it is used correctly, the math means there is no way to break it. The agent in the field had a pad. The sender had a matching copy. Numbers were read aloud over the air. Anyone else who heard them heard noise. The agent heard instructions. This was not an exotic or improvised approach. It was a historically sound method, chosen by serious people operating under serious constraints. The simplicity was the strength. A radio, a pad, a pencil. Nothing else required. Early reports of unusual broadcasts, voices reading groups of numbers in steady, flat tones, began appearing in monitoring logs around this period. Monitoring organizations and amateur listeners noted them without always knowing what to make of them. They sounded official, they sounded deliberate, but they matched no known civilian service. Inside a transmission facility of that era, the environment had its own distinct character. Banks of equipment lined the walls, meters blinked, coils hummed at a low, constant frequency. A console rack from the 1970s might carry dials worn smooth by years of adjustment. Crackling static filled the background, punctuated by the flutter of a signal bouncing down through the ionosphere from somewhere distant and unspecified. For the people operating those stations, this was routine work. For the people listening from the outside, something about it felt charged. Simon Mason was one of the listeners who decided routine was not enough of an answer. He began organizing other hobbyists, people scattered across different countries who had been keeping their own logs independently, and turned their scattered notes into a shared, systematic record. He was methodical about it. He understood that tape recordings and handwritten logs were fragile. They could be lost, erased, or simply forgotten. His focus was on preservation, on making sure that what people had heard and written down would still exist later, when the context might finally become clear. Under Simon's coordination, volunteers began reporting consistently instead of occasionally. Individual sightings of unusual broadcasts became connected entries in a broader catalogue. Stations that had seemed isolated and unrelated started showing patterns. Timing, interval tunes, formats that repeated. The picture that emerged was not random. It suggested organization at a scale that a single hobbyist could not have seen alone. Some of those stations later became the most discussed in the field. Two in particular, known by the names of the musical tunes that opened each broadcast, were identified by some researchers as likely run by British intelligence from a signals facility in Cyprus. That claim has never been officially confirmed, but it has also never been fully dismissed.
What Simon and the people around him were building was something that intelligence services would never build publicly. A civilian record of what the airwaves actually carried. And that record would matter later, when people started asking harder questions about specific stations and specific broadcasts. But here is the question that sits underneath all of this. How did a technical method become a cultural and operational fixture across continents? So, we've talked about what number stations are and how the shortwave bands filled up with them. Now let's talk about what it actually felt like to encounter one. Not in the abstract, but the moment you spun a dial, heard something strange, and couldn't let it go. 3 stations in particular became touchstones for listeners: the Lincolnshire Poacher, Cherry Ripe, and the Buzzer. Each one earned a name, and each name meant something. Let's look at why.
Imagine tuning a shortwave radio late at night. The band is full of static, distant voices and faint interference. Then, cutting through all of it, a small, bright tune. 2 bars of a familiar English folk melody, repeated over and over, cheerful, mechanical, completely out of place. That was the Lincolnshire Poacher. A jaunty little interval signal played on what sounded like a tinny synthesizer, looping again and again before a flat female voice began reading out blocks of numbers. 5 digits, pause, 5 more, on, with no explanation and no sign-off. From the 1960s through the 1980s, shortwave monitors across Europe and beyond logged stations like this one with increasing regularity. Hobbyist listening had grown into a serious pursuit. People kept notebooks. They cross-referenced frequencies, times, and audio signatures. They compared notes. And when they kept hearing that same 2-bar tune, they needed something to call it. The name came from the song itself. The Lincolnshire Poacher, a traditional English folk tune. Nobody official supplied the label. Listeners gave it one. That act of naming was small, but it mattered. Once a signal had a name, it had an identity. It could be tracked, discussed, and remembered. Cherry Ripe followed a similar pattern. Another brief English tune used as an interval signal, another monotone voice reading numbers in the same measured cadence. Monitors noted the similarities between the two stations: the audio style, the format, the English language delivery. Many in the hobbyist community began connecting both signals to British transmission infrastructure. RAF Akrotiri in Cyprus was a name that circulated widely as a suspected origin, but no public official confirmation has ever been provided. Some listeners went further. They claimed the Lincolnshire Poacher and Cherry Ripe were officially run by British intelligence from that site. It was a plausible claim given the audio signatures and transmission patterns, but plausible is not confirmed. What the record shows is that monitors heard something consistent, gave it a name, and the name stuck, with all its associations still attached. Then there was the buzzer. No cheerful melody here, just a harsh, droning buzz, repeating at regular intervals around the clock, occasionally broken by a voice reading call signs or numbers, but mostly just the tone, steady and indifferent. Where the Lincolnshire Poacher felt oddly whimsical, the buzzer felt blunt. It didn't try to mask itself behind a tune, it just persisted. Simon Mason was one of the monitors who spent years cataloguing signals like these. When he first encountered a recording of the Lincolnshire Poacher's interval tune, he described a feeling of genuine awe, not at any mystery of origin, but at the pattern itself. The same sequence, preserved across dozens of recordings, lobbed by different people in different countries, all pointing to the same source. That consistency was striking in a way that was hard to explain to anyone who hadn't heard it. Simon didn't just listen, he amplified. He shared labeled recordings in public forums. He attached careful metadata to each capture: frequency, time, duration, audio notes. He understood that a recording without context was just noise. A recording with a name, a date, and a matched entry in someone else's log was something else entirely. It was evidence of a shared experience. And shared experiences, however strange, tend to build their own momentum.
What strikes me about all three of these, the Poacher, Cherry Ripe, the buzzer, is that the naming wasn't random. People were doing something deliberate. They were taking something anonymous and making it knowable. That changes how you relate to it. But here's where it gets interesting. Once those names were out there, once the recordings were circulating, the question shifted. It was no longer just about what you heard. It was about what others did with it. How did individual, odd-sounding broadcasts become fixed identities and shared stories? So, at this point in the story, we have isolated broadcasts, strange voices, numbers read into the air with no obvious explanation. But something changed in the 80s and 90s. What had been a scattered hobby started to become something much more organized. Groups of listeners began comparing notes, sharing recordings, building catalogs. And when they started to see the same patterns turning up across different frequencies and different countries, the question stopped being just personal curiosity. It became something bigger.
Picture a small apartment at 2 a.m, a radio receiver on a desk, a notebook open beside it, someone sitting in the dark writing down numbers as a flat female voice reads them aloud. That scene was playing out in hundreds of homes across Europe and North America, each listener alone, but all of them hearing the same thing. In the 1980s, hobbyist monitoring networks began to formalize what individuals had been doing on their own for years. Groups like Enigma, and later Enigma 2000, started building systematic records. They logged broadcast schedules, they compared interval signals, the short musical or tonal sequences that opened many transmissions. They cross-referenced what one monitor in Germany heard with what another heard in the United Kingdom. Gradually, patterns emerged. Simon Mason was among those working to bring some order to this material. He understood that isolated recordings meant very little on their own. But a durable, well-documented catalogue, schedules, recordings, interval signals, all cross-referenced, that was something a researcher could actually use. He was driven to systematize, to turn a flood of strange audio into something coherent and verifiable. But Simon was also concerned about what happened when recordings circulated without context. A flat voice reading numbers in the dark sounds different to someone who has never heard a shortwave broadcast before. Strip away the technical background, and the strangeness fills in fast. So he began writing explanatory notes alongside recordings, not to diminish them, but to give listeners enough grounding to think clearly about what they were hearing. He also worked to connect isolated monitors into a network. Listeners who had been working alone could now compare observations with others. That collaboration produced something valuable, a shared body of evidence, built carefully, over years. Then, in the 1990s, public awareness widened sharply. A project called the Conet Project compiled reportings of number stations and released them in a form that anyone could hear. These were not clean, produced audio files. They were raw captures, static interference, the slightly unreal quality of shortwave at odd hours. That rawness was part of what made them land so hard. Newspapers picked up the story. Late-night radio programs discussed it. Online forums, still new at the time, began to fill with speculation. Each retelling pulled the most striking details to the front. The buzzer that sounded before transmissions on one Russian station. The monotone cadence of a voice that never paused, never hurried, never acknowledged the listener. Those details circulated and repeated until they felt less like facts and more like folklore. Some of the theories that spread were harder to support than others. One claim that found wide circulation was at UVB 76. The Russian station known for its buzzer was some kind of automated retaliation trigger, set to fire a signal if the people monitoring it went silent. That idea was compelling. It mapped onto fears that were already very much alive, but the evidence behind it remained thin, and serious monitors tended to treat it with caution. What was harder to argue with was the broader dynamic at work. The same audio that monitors had carefully catalogued for years was now being heard by audiences who had no frame of reference for it. And without that frame, ordinary technical transmissions could be recast as something far more threatening. Collective anxiety, fed by repeated retellings, had real weight. It shaped how people understood what they were hearing, and it shaped what questions they thought were worth asking.
There is something worth sitting with here. The recordings were real. The patterns monitors logged were real. The archives that groups like Enigma built were careful, serious work. But the meaning layered onto all of that grew through a process that had as much to do with how information spreads as with what the broadcasts actually were. Which brings us to the next question. Because behind all of this, the recordings, the catalogs, the press stories, there were actual people making decisions about what to preserve and how to present it. So who were the people who turned stray transmissions into preserved records and press stories? So, we've talked about the broadcasts themselves. Now, let's talk about the people who decided those broadcasts were worth saving. Because none of this reaches us by accident. Someone had to sit down, press record, and then do something with what they captured. That choice, to preserve rather than simply listen and move on, turned scattered signals into something lasting.
For much of the Cold War era, the people monitoring number stations worked quietly and without recognition. They were hobbyists mostly, amateur radio enthusiasts who spent evenings scanning shortwave frequencies, logging what they found, and comparing notes with others doing the same thing. Picture a dim living room, a battered shortwave radio sitting on a coffee table, static breaking now and then into something stranger, a cheerful interval tune in tinny mono, then a voice reading numbers in a flat, measured tone. The listener writes it down, date, time, frequency, then waits to see if it happens again. This was the work, patient, repetitive, often unrewarded. But over time, those logs built into something valuable. Patterns emerged, schedules became visible, frequencies that seemed random started to show structure. The hobbyist community was, in effect, building an evidence base, without any coordinating authority, without funding, and without knowing what they would eventually find. Simon Mason became one of the more visible figures in this world. He approached the work with a methodical care that stood out even among dedicated monitors. His logs were detailed. His notes included context, not just raw data. He wasn't just capturing what he heard. He was documenting how he heard it, and what he did and didn't know about the source. That distinction mattered. Simon understood that a recording without context could mislead as easily as it could inform. So when he shared material with journalists and researchers, he made a point of explaining the limits of what the recordings actually proved. He was proud of what he had preserved, but he was also clear-eyed about what preservation alone could and couldn't tell you. That kind of careful framing influenced how others in the field approached their own material. Researchers who came to Simon for context found that he resisted easy answers. He'd walk them through what the logs showed and remind them, gently, of what remained unknown. His curatorial choices shaped which recordings entered wider circulation, and the care he attached to them helped set a standard for how that material was discussed. Then, in 1997, a small record label called Eardale Discs released something that changed the conversation entirely. The Conet Project was a compilation of number station recordings, drawn from hobbyist archives. It brought these sounds to a much wider audience. Music listeners, artists, writers, people who had never touched a shortwave dial. Suddenly, number stations weren't just a niche obsession, they were a cultural reference point. It's important to be clear about what the Conet Project was and wasn't. It was a secondary archival compilation, a carefully assembled collection of existing recordings, not an official record. It didn't link stations to specific operators. It didn't confirm who ran what or why. What it did was make the sounds accessible and give them cultural weight. That alone shifted how people thought about number stations. Some of the recordings that gained the most attention came from stations like Lincolnshire, Poacher, and Cherry Ripe, both identified by their distinctive interval tunes. Some researchers have claimed these were run by British intelligence, broadcasting from RAF Akrotiri in Cyprus. That claim is plausible, and it has circulated widely, but it has never been officially confirmed. The archivists preserved the sounds. They couldn't verify the story behind them.
That's the tension at the heart of all this archival work. The recordings are real. The effort behind them is real. But the gap between what was captured and what it actually means is still wide open. And filling that gap responsibly takes a very different kind of work. Which brings us to the question that sits underneath all of it. What responsibility do archivists and hobbyists carry when their preservation amplifies unknown actors. So far, we have talked about who was listening and what they heard. Now, the question shifts. What did investigators actually find when they started digging? What do the documents say? And just as importantly, what do they leave unanswered? The answer turns out to be more specific than most people expect, and in at least one well-documented case, it moved the whole conversation from guesswork into a courtroom.
Direction finding is a radio technique with a long history. You run the same signal through receivers at different locations, measure the angles, and triangulate back to a source. Dedicated monitors had been doing this with number stations since the Cold War years. Some worked alone, some coordinated across national borders. The logs they kept were meticulous. Frequencies, times, signal strengths, bearing estimates. Simon Mason had spent years building one of the most carefully organized archives of this kind of material. His records did not just capture what was heard. They tracked scheduling patterns, regional signal behavior, and correlations across different monitoring sites. When researchers and journalists came looking, his archive gave them something to work with. But Simon knew what those records could and could not prove. Direction-finding estimates could point toward a broad geographic region. They could support or contradict a claim about a transmitter's location. What they could not do on their own was confirm who authorized a broadcast, who was meant to receive it, or what any specific sequence of numbers meant. That gap frustrated him. Hobbyist evidence had real value. It had helped journalists, and it had helped researchers place certain signals in time and geography. But when matched against official files, the difference in depth was obvious. Classified records could answer questions that no shortwave log ever could. Then, in the 1990s and into the 2000s, something changed. US federal prosecutions tied to Cuban intelligence produced court documents that went further than anything hobbyist archives had managed. The FBI had recovered materials, prosecutors had filed evidence, and some of that evidence described radio broadcasts, including what became known as the Atención broadcasts, as part of an operational communication system used for espionage. This was documented legal proof, not speculation. Court records established that numbers-style radio broadcasts had been used operationally. Agents received messages. Instructions were transmitted. The broadcasts were not background noise or a hobbyist curiosity. They were working tradecraft. That finding changed the conversation significantly. Simon saw it happen in real time. The legal records moved the discussion out of folklore and into evidentiary territory. He began cross-referencing the monitoring logs in his archive with what the court materials described: scheduling patterns, frequency usage, timing windows. He expanded his metadata to include direction-finding notes and scheduling correlations, so that researchers could make those comparisons more precisely. Still, the court documents answered a specific question about a specific case. They confirmed operational use in that context. What they did not do was settle the broader picture. Some people have claimed over the years that number stations were routinely used to send activation orders to agents positioned in Western countries. That idea is possible in principle, but for most of the famous cases and most of the stations in the catalogues, it remains unproven. The documented record simply does not go that far. The stakes here are worth naming plainly. The prosecutorial record confirms that at least some broadcasts served real operational purposes. That is not a small thing. But documentary proof in one case does not automatically extend to every signal ever logged. The gaps between what the logs show or the court files describe and what actually happened across decades of shortwave transmission remain real and largely unfilled.
So the investigative record gives us something solid to stand on. A real prosecution, real evidence, real confirmation that these broadcasts were used for espionage, at least in some documented instances. That is more than most people expected the archives to deliver. But it also leaves a genuine question sitting right in front of us. What do direction-finding data and court files actually show, and where do they leave gaps? So, we have heard the skeptics, we have heard the officials, but there is another side to this, and it deserves a fair hearing. Because for a significant number of people who actually sat with these broadcasts, who logged them, who studied them over years, the case for espionage use was not a guess. It felt like the only explanation that fit. Simon Mason was one of those people who helped bring that case into the open. He worked to make sure the testimony of serious monitors reached a wider audience. And what those monitors described was hard to dismiss. Let us walk through it.
From the 1960s onward, shortwave bands around the world filled with something unusual. Voices, strings of numbers, tones, signals that came and went with no explanation attached. Hobbyist radio operators began logging them in large numbers. They gave the stations informal names, they compared notes, and the more they listened, the more certain patterns emerged. The voices were almost always flat, monotone, often female, reading numbers in a steady rhythm that sounded almost mechanical. There was no greeting, no sign-off, no explanation of any kind. Just numbers, delivered with the calm precision of something that had been done 1,000 times before. Believers pointed to a simple, practical argument. One-way shortwave broadcasts are ideal for covert communication. A receiver needs no transmitter. There is no signal to trace back. An agent anywhere in the world with a basic radio can receive a message without ever revealing their location. That logic is sound. Intelligence agencies have used one-way communication methods for exactly these reasons. The tradecraft rationale was not invented, it was real. What strengthened the Believer case further was consistency. The same stations appeared on the same frequencies at the same times, sometimes for years. The format did not drift, the voice cadences did not change. To experienced monitors, that kind of discipline pointed to an organization, something with resources and purpose, not a hobby, not a test. Simon Mason helped structure and share the evidence that monitors had gathered. He worked to bring archives of logged transmissions into public forums, showing the recurring patterns in a way that was hard to wave away. His approach was earnest and methodical. He did not push dramatic interpretations. He let the patterns speak. And those patterns convinced people, serious people, people who had spent real time with the material. Then there was UVB-76, a frequency associated with Russian and Soviet transmissions. It broadcast a continuous buzzer tone, hour after hour, day after day, year after year. And occasionally, without warning, the buzzer stopped. A voice came through, a short message. Then the buzzer returned. That combination, the endless monotone interrupted by a single brief transmission, struck many listeners as exactly what a high-priority alert system would look like. Some came to believe it was a trigger of some kind, a signal connected to military readiness at the highest level. The belief was not baseless in emotional terms. The format matched what people imagined a critical military signal would be: persistent, unmissable, impossible to accidentally overlook. If you needed to be absolutely certain a message had been received, or that a system was still active. A continuous tone with rare interruptions would do exactly that. The logic of the format fed the interpretation. And the stakes were real in a human sense. Simon's work amplified practitioner testimony in public forums. It gave weight to what hobbyists had logged. It helped move the conversation from fringe speculation towards something that news outlets, researchers, and occasionally legal authorities took seriously. Belief, in this case, shaped action. People kept monitoring. They kept filing reports. They kept building the record. Some of that scrutiny landed on real individuals and real organizations. The conviction that something operational was happening had consequences beyond radio logs. What made the Believer case stick was not just emotion. It was structure, consistent formats, rational tradecraft logic, documented patterns, testimony from people who had spent years listening carefully. For those inside that world, the conclusion was not a leap. It was where the evidence pointed. And for a long time, very little was offered to point elsewhere.
That is the Believer case, at its strongest. And it held. For decades, it held. The monitors were not credulous. They were patient, careful, and often deeply knowledgeable. Their certainty had roots. So the question worth sitting with now is this: what specific evidence and reasoning made belief in espionage use feel convincing to so many observers? So far, we've been sitting with the mystery, letting the signals speak for themselves, hearing what listeners believed they meant. But at some point, curiosity has to meet a harder question. What can we actually prove? And where does the evidence run out? That's where we are now. Not dismissing what people heard, just asking what the methods, the real investigative tools available to hobbyists and researchers could and couldn't establish.
By the 1980s, listening to shortwave numbers, stations had moved beyond a handful of dedicated radio enthusiasts. Monitoring groups were formalizing their work. Organizations like Enigma began building structured catalogs, logging frequencies, schedules, transmission patterns, interval signals. It was methodical. It was serious. And it produced a genuinely impressive body of recorded material. Then in the 1990s, the Conet Project compiled many of those iconic recordings into a widely circulated collection. Suddenly, this niche obsession had an audience far beyond the shortwave community. People who had never touched a radio dial were listening to automated voices reading strings of numbers into the void. The cultural reach grew. So did the speculation. But here is where it gets complicated. Interest and evidence are not the same thing. A catalogue of recordings tells you a transmission happened. It tells you a frequency, a time, sometimes a rough geographic direction. What it cannot tell you with certainty is who sent it and why. Direction finding, known as DF, was one of the key tools researchers used to try to locate transmitters. The technique is real and it works, up to a point. Multiple receivers in different locations can triangulate a signal's origin. That can narrow a transmitter down to a region, sometimes a specific country, but it cannot walk through a door and name the operator sitting inside. Take the stations known as Lincolnshire, Poacher, and Cherry Ripe. Some researchers, and some claims that circulated widely in the monitoring community, pointed to RAF Acriterian's Cyprus as the source. The logic was plausible. Direction-finding work had, in various cases, implicated transmitters at Allied military bases or facilities, including sites on Cyprus, for English-language stations. That is a real and documented pattern of suspicion. But suspicion is not confirmation. Without an official acknowledgement, the attribution remained circumstantial. Simon Mason understood this tension well. He was among those who worked carefully with archived material, sorting recordings, cross-referencing schedules, helping to build the kind of structured record that serious researchers could use. And he was measured about what that record could support. He recognized, over time, where the hobbyist evidence hit its limits. The logs were real, the patterns were real. But patterns are not proof of intent, and frequency data is not a signed order. That recognition changed how Simon worked. He began adding cautionary notes to archival material, flagging where attribution was firm and where it was inference. He looked for corroboration before attaching any public claim to a specific operator or agency. It was a careful position, and not always a popular one. When people have spent years listening and cataloging, they want answers that match the effort. The wider methodological problem is this: numbers, stations operated in a world of deliberate ambiguity, no call signs, no licensing, no operator identification. That was the point. The transmissions were designed to be deniable, so every tool used to analyze them, direction finding, pattern analysis, schedule comparison, runs into the same wall. The signal exists, the sender does not officially exist. That matters beyond academic tidiness. If a researcher, or a journalist, or a broadcaster publicly names a specific intelligence agency as the operator of a specific station, and that claim turns out to be wrong, the consequences are real. Reputations, diplomatic sensitivities, and the credibility of the broader research community all sit in the balance. Methodological clarity is not just cautious, it is protective.
None of this means the research was wasted. The catalogues, the recordings, the direction-finding work, all of it built a picture that is genuinely informative. It's just a picture with some important gaps still in it. Gaps that the available tools, on their own, couldn't close. Which brings us to the question that sits at the center of all of this. Which pieces of evidence reliably indicate operational espionage, and which only suggest plausible scenarios? The signals eventually faded for many stations, but the questions they left behind did not. And for some people, those questions became something more lasting than curiosity. This is where the story gets interesting in a different way. Not in the machinery or the mystery, but in what people did with what they heard, and what it still means to them now.
Picture a city apartment at night. Someone sits alone at a desk, a radio glowing softly in the dark, a notebook open beside them. They are not a spy, they are not in danger, they are just listening, and they have been listening for years. This was the reality for thousands of shortwave hobbyists as the internet arrived and changed everything. Stations that had broadcast through the Cold War began to go quiet one by one. But some did not disappear. Some adapted. In the post-Cold War years, a number of stations shifted from voice and Morse code toward digital formats and data bursts, a sign that the tradecraft itself was evolving, not ending. And then there was UVB 76, a Russian shortwave frequency, a buzzer that droned on, almost without interruption, day after day, year after year. Occasionally, it was broken by a voice reading out names and numbers. No one outside the system could say for certain what it meant. Online, the theories multiplied. Some claimed it was tied to Russian nuclear retaliation planning, a kind of automated failsafe that would trigger if the signal ever stopped. That idea spread widely across forums and streaming communities. It was dramatic, it was frightening, and it was, at best, speculative. No verified evidence has confirmed it. What did happen was something arguably more interesting. UVB76 became a live internet phenomenon. People streamed it around the clock. Communities formed to log every transmission, every anomaly, every unexplained pause. The buzzer became a kind of shared ritual, strange, unresolved, strangely comforting in its consistency. Simon Mason had watched this shift happen in real time. He had spent years monitoring and archiving shortwave transmissions, and now he found himself in new territory. The sounds he had once heard on a crackling receiver were being streamed to listeners across the world who had never touched a radio dial. That felt significant to him, not just as a technical fact, but as a responsibility. Simon engaged with the new streaming communities. He participated in public conversations about how these recordings should be framed, what context listeners needed, and what damage could be done by presenting archive material without it. He felt the weight of interpretation. Archives are not neutral. The way a sound is labeled or left unlabeled shapes what people believe about it. Meanwhile, the sounds themselves had found new life in music and art. Samples of shortwave transmissions appeared in albums and installations. The eerie quality of numbers being read aloud over static became an aesthetic choice, a texture that artists used to evoke distance, secrecy, and something unresolved. The signals had moved off the airwaves and into culture. There is something worth sitting with here. The cultural life of these broadcasts, the communities, the art, the archived recordings, carries real weight even when the technical facts remain uncertain. Public memory is shaped by what gets preserved and how it gets told. That is not a small thing. It is a reminder that how we interpret the past has consequences, even when the past is strange and poorly documented.
The broadcasts themselves may have changed shape. Some went digital, some went silent, some are still running. But the emotional pull they created, that sense of something hidden and unresolved, that part did not go away with the Cold War. So here is the question I keep coming back to, and it is the one that leads us into the final part of this story. What remains when the excitement fades? Recordings, communities, and questions that still pull at listeners. We've covered a lot of ground in this episode. Signals heard around the world, listeners who logged them for years, legal cases that brought some of the mystery into open court, and claims that ran far ahead of anything the documents could actually support. So where does that leave us? What can we honestly say, and what should we hold back? That's what this final part is about.
Picture a dim living room, a battered shortwave radio sitting on a coffee table. The speaker crackles. Ionospheric flutter stretches and warps a voice reading numbers into something almost unrecognizable. For decades, that sound drew in curious people from all walks of life. Some were hobbyists, some were researchers, some were trying to make sense of a world that seemed to be communicating in code all around them. Simon Mason was one of the people who took that curiosity seriously and chose to do something responsible with it. He helped build the kind of careful, documented record that separates what we actually know from what we only suspect. That kind of work is harder than it sounds, especially when public interest pulls strongly toward dramatic answers. So here is what the documentary record does support. Numbers, stations were real. They transmitted coded messages using one-time pad encryption. Some of them are used for espionage. The Cuban legal cases are the clearest example we have. Prosecutorial records and monitoring logs confirmed that specific broadcasts carried genuine operational communications to agents working in the field. That is not speculation. That is documented. Direction-finding techniques and long-term pattern analysis have allowed researchers to draw plausible links between certain stations and certain governments. Those are reasonable inferences based on real methodology, but reasonable inference is not the same as confirmed fact. Without official records or direct testimony, those attributions remain educated assessments, not established history. Take the case of Lincolnshire Poacher and Cherry Ripe. Many researchers consider it highly plausible that British intelligence operated those stations from an RAF base in Cyprus. The geographic signal analysis points in that direction. But no official confirmation has been made public. Plausible is not the same as proven. Holding that distinction matters. And then there are the claims that stretched well past what the evidence can carry. The idea that UVB-76, the Russian buzzer station, functions as some kind of nuclear retaliation mechanism, is speculative. It circulates widely, but it rests on very thin sourcing. Similarly, the broader claim that number stations were routinely used to issue activation orders to large-scale sleeper networks across Western countries is possible in principle, but for the most famous and widely discussed cases, it has not been documented. Scholarly consensus as it stands today reflects exactly this balance. Number stations were real coded transmissions. Some served genuine espionage functions, but many operator identities remain unconfirmed, and many specific message contents are still unknown. The most sensational stories told about these broadcasts, the ones involving universal covert networks or catastrophic fail-safe systems, are weakly sourced. They should be treated as conjecture unless primary official records emerge to support them. Simon dedicated real effort to making sure that distinction stayed visible, even when it was not what people wanted to hear. He advocated for careful public framing at a time when ambiguous material was easy to sensationalize. He worked with researchers and supported access to corroborating records wherever they existed. That kind of measured, compassionate approach to difficult evidence is not flashy, but it is what honest inquiry looks like. What this episode has tried to do is honor both sides of that tension. The experiences of listeners who heard something strange and real in the static deserve respect. The documented cases of genuine espionage used deserve clear acknowledgement. And the claims that exceed what the record supports deserve to be named as such, not with contempt, but with honesty. That is the only way to keep the conversation worth having.
Numbers stations are a real piece of Cold War history, and in some form, low-tech resilient communication continues today. There is still plenty we do not know. Governments hold records that have never been released. Former intelligence officers have never spoken publicly. Archives that could clarify a lot of this remain closed. Which brings us to the question worth sitting with. Which archives, declassifications, or testimonies would most clearly advance understanding? And what responsibilities do listeners hold when engaging with ambiguous evidence?